we are now honored to welcome Professor Simon Schama from Columbia University. To discuss the Anglo-Jewish community and the Balfour Decleration.
Thank you. It's a pleasure and an honor to be here, of course, at this time and to celebrate what we're celebrating. Academics really try overwhelmingly to be led by their head. Possibly Jewish academics less than, but it's impossible, of course, not to be led by one's heart as well as one's head on a day like today, and through the celebrations that were marked so exuberantly and unapologetically in London last week. And in the sense of being emotionally moved as well as intellectually stirred and provoked, particularly by the contributions of my two distinguished colleagues previously, which a number of points of which I want to resume and take up and emphasize. It's impossible not to feel, particularly if you come from Britain, because British Jews were, after all, within just 22 miles, the breadth of the English Channel, from suffering the same fate as our European continental brothers and sisters. It's impossible not to feel, when you come to Israel, and I come a lot, the defeat of Hitler's extermination, not to at all efface the atrocity and horror of the Shoah and those millions of Jewish lives that were lost, but he was defeated, and you're the proof of that. Israel and the Jewish people and the culture which the Nazis also wished to annihilate lives and flourishes. Now we're marking a 100-year anniversary of the Balfour Declaration, which seems a very long time ago, but when I was born in 1945, the war was not yet over. I was born in the middle of a bombing raid, actually, which destroyed most of the street except the nursing home in which I was born. Another defeat for the, for the Third Reich. It was just 28 years before that moment, and for my father in particular, both my parents, the way in which the East End of London, the way in which the modestly, not the grandees of the Jewish community, but the vast majority of the Anglo-Jewish population received that news was very fresh in his mind. He was 16 years old when news of the Balfour Declaration, about a week after that letter was sent to Walter Lord Rothschild, and he remembered it very well. He remembered in particular, actually, an extraordinary improvised eruption of celebration on the streets of Whitechapel and Stepney. There'd already been a celebration that Weizmann and Sokolow and the Zionist Federation had had privately on the evening, although famously, as he remembered in Trial and Error, Chaim Weizmann, when Mark Sykes came to him with bearing the document, Weizmann and Mark Sykes said, "It's a boy." Weizmann said, "Well, I didn't like the look of that boy. It wasn't what I was expecting," because he'd wanted the wording to be different. He'd wanted the wording, which was the case in one of the many earlier drafts Zionist Federation had submitted to the government, to talk about not the establishment of a national home, a Jewish national home in Palestine, but the re-establishment of a Jewish national home in Palestine. Significant difference, and he wanted the sense of Palestine to be conveyed as, in its entirety, the Jewish national home. He didn't get that, but euphoria nonetheless broke out. But my father also remembered a week after that, a month after that, on December the 2nd, 1917, an official celebration of the Balfour Declaration, embraced as it was by the East End Jews. And I want to say a word in a minute about the difference between East End Jews and West End Jews. And my father remembers, because he didn't have any chance at all of being admitted to that illustrious celebration inside Covent Garden Opera House, standing with a huge swarm of Jews outside the Royal Opera House. He told me, standing between sacks of tomorrow's cabbages and potatoes, as the Hatikva was being sung, as it was indeed sung on the stage of Covent Garden. What I want to say is that one of the most remarkable things about the unfolding of the Balfour Declaration is that at that time, Zionism, organized Zionism in Britain, was numerically and in other ways very, very weak. There were perhaps no more than, at most, 5,000 members of the Zionist Federation. And they had famously little offices on Piccadilly. It was said that Nachum Sokolow's entire correspondence and archive could be fitted into a fairly small shoebox. That was the story anyway. But there's no doubt that if the Balfour Declaration was not made from the numerical strength of Zionism, the opposite was not true. What happened after the Balfour Declaration was an extraordinary flowering of Zionist support, both as official members of the Federation and emotively as well. But I suspect, nonetheless, actually, that emotively, in a non-institutional sense, Zionism was actually much stronger in Britain than strictly membership cards would have suggested. Everybody, my family, not my father, who was born in 1901, but the larger family, remembered the last great occasion when Zionism made its presence felt publicly in the East End. And that was 20 years before, in the summer of 1896, where Herzl came to give a talk reporting on his attempted negotiations in Istanbul, which would follow on, of course, actually, in 1898, when the climax of which was actually meeting the Kaiser in Jerusalem, here on the Street of the Prophets. But Theodor Herzl, in search of Jewish support, had made 2 visits to Britain, but the one in the summer of 1896 was after the publication of the Judenstaat. And again, very surprisingly, the Judenstaat was actually, amidst the Jewish community of Western Europe, a flop. It was not a success. Only 5,000 copies were initially printed in German. Something like 300 copies were printed in Britain. The editor of the Jewish Chronicle could barely, who was not a Zionist at that point, nor was the newspaper, could barely manage to mention it. But Herzl came to talk to the Jewish Working Men's Association in Great Ailey Street, just around the corner from Fieldgate Street, where there was a great synagogue where the Shamas were living at the time. And a gigantic throng of people came from all over London, but particularly from East London, from Stepney and Bethnal Green and Whitechapel and Aldgate and Mile End. And that was the moment. Herzl was thunderstruck, actually, by the enthusiasm, because he was feeling in the summer of 1896 extremely beleaguered. 2 people who'd been vital to his plans to try and mobilize support in England were very conspicuously missing from that crowd in Great Ailey Street. One was Colonel Albert Goldsmith, who had been born in India as a member of a British imperial family and had subsequently discovered his Jewish identity. He liked to begin every conversation with the remarks, "I am Daniel Deronda," and who'd founded an organization called the Maccabeans, which had branches through Britain called the Tent, and with whom Herzl, rather extraordinarily, I suppose patrician to patrician, had thought he'd got on very well. The other was Samuel Montague, the businessman from the north of Britain, who'd also promised support. But they had both actually, once they'd read the Judenstaat, they actually thought that, as they understood it, maximalist Zionist program unlike the gradualism of the Chochmah Zion, was actually likely to queer the pitch, actually to cause more trouble for the long-term prospects of Zionism than this much more gradualist, organic plantation of a Jewish community in Palestine. So they were slightly recoiled from the notion, as they thought of Herzl's charismatic leadership, Herzl's insistence on crashing his way through the doors of powerful statesmen. And Herzl at that point in the 1890s was, of course, not at all committed to a British way ahead. If anything, he thought it was going to be much more likely that the Kaiser, the German Kaiser, William II, was much more likely to establish a German protectorate for a Jewish Palestine in return for the funding of the Ottoman debt. So in some extraordinary way, even though there was a moment, an event of great excitement and euphoria going on in 1896, it pretty much dissipated thereafter. And the Zionist movement and the anti-Zionists, as they thought of themselves, remained at loggerheads for quite some time, all the way through 1917. One of those who'd been a friend to Herzl, Lucian Wolff, the historian and essayist, became the leader of the so-called Conjoint Committee in England, which was devoted to stopping the Zionist project, at least in the sense in which Chaim Weizmann and Sokolov and the Zionist Federation wanted it. At stake, of course, for these two parties, who actually slugged it out in the columns of the Times in 1917, in May 1917. The editor of the Times newspaper was a man called Wickham Steed, who was really no friend either of Zionism or of Jews at that point, but he was prepared to give an arena to both sides. He made sure that the anti-Zionists got their oar in first on May the 24th, and although it's been suggested that he did a certain amount of delaying tactic because the Zionists came back with their counterattack on May the 28th, precisely at the time when preparations of the original draft were being made, not only by Weizmann and Sokolov, but friends like Mark Sykes, absolutely crucial to the whole enterprise, as Martin Kramer rightly said. So there was an extraordinary sense, really, that everything boiled down to that one word, home. A home, a national home for the Jews in Palestine. And for the anti-Zionists, who were led in the cabinet by Edward Montagu, the notion that you could somehow legislate a Jewish national home in Palestine was about to open the Jewish community in England to charges of divided allegiance. And those on the Zionist side, well, it's all very well for Edwin Montagu to say that, but his kind of home is manorial, as a great kind of country house, complete with game birds and avenues of elm and oak. But the sense in which really Montagu, to be fair to him, had the sense that for hundreds of years, ever since the de facto readmission of Jews to England, led by the famous names, the Cousinhood, the Mercators, the Montefiores, the Goldsmiths, had struggled, and the Rothschilds, to be sure, had struggled towards emancipation. And that this was suddenly going to be put in jeopardy. Montagu even called the Balfour Declaration, this was extraordinary, and again my father remembered that with great bitterness and chagrin, an anti-Semitic document because of the danger he thought it would put Jews in. Montagu's point was that if the British endorsed the idea of a national home, the next thing that you would know would be that Jews would be shown to the door and would be told, if that's your home, then go to it and leave us alone. And you have to remember that in 1917, there is a kind of undertow, there's a kind of ugly, slightly poisonous rumble of anti-Semitic literature and writing going on. Writers like G.K. Chesterton and Hilaire Belloc, and the journalist Leopold Maxer. They had been, in fact, earlier in 1904, 1905, there had been an organisation called the British Brothers League, which had demonized the Jews, particularly the new influx of Jews from Russia, as unhealthy, uneducated, all these prone to criminal activity, everything that Jews in fact were not. But there was a kind of rhetoric that had a place in British public discourse and which led to the passage of the Aliens Act in 1905 in the government of Lord Balfour, I have to say, as well. Whether or not Lord Balfour, who then met Chaim Weizmann 1 year after the passage of the Aliens Act, was caused to have second thoughts about that is a very interesting historical issue. So the debate between two senses of exigency about what home for the Jews could mean met in collision inside the Jewish community. And what happened in 1917 was really the Rothschilds, so wonderful to have Lord Rothschild here, the good Rothschilds, because there were Rothschilds on the anti-Zionist side as well, particularly Leopold, notwithstanding the grandeur of their manorial establishments in Britain, chose actually to actively and eloquently and passionately to throw their lot in effect, with the East End rather than the West End. And I don't want to over-polarize it to say that the Montefioris and the Macassars and the Goldsmiths were all anti-Zionist. They were not. They split down the middle. Claude Montefiore, a mighty intellect, one of the leaders of the Reform movement, was a bitter anti-Zionist, but Francis Montefiore was actually just as much a passionate Zionist. But one thing, actually, which, even though Martin Kramer's quite right, it's very difficult to find rich evidence either of Philo-Semitic discussion in the very beady-eyed talks that the cabinet had. Two things I think were very important in making sure that the voice of the East End, there is a sense not just actually of Russian Jews and poorer Jews dislodging the leadership of the cousinhood, but also provincial Britain. The crucial breakthrough, of course, for Weizmann was the fact he happened to be in Manchester. And in Manchester, he met Harry Sacker, the lawyer. He met Simon Marx. He met the C family. They were beginning to constitute an alternative cousinhood of knowledge, of science, of commerce, and of journalism. If anything, another unsung hero was Harry Sacker, because he was both a lawyer and a journalist. It was Harry Sacker who opened the door to the editor of The Guardian, C.B. Scott, and it was Scott who in turn opened the doors to the high and mighty of liberal politics of that period. It was actually through Scott that Weizmann met Balfour on an election campaign in 1906 in the first place. The predisposition towards listening to the East End, as it were, did come partly from, exactly as Martin Kramer said, the horrifying events that were unfolding in the First World War. I can't stress enough, reinforcing Martin's point, that we all think very clearly and in terms of the tragic epic of the relationship between the Shah and the Second World War and the foundation of the State of Israel. It's as important to think of the First World War and the Balfour Declaration, or at least the sense of the critical issue of uprootedness, of homelessness that Pinsker had first identified in 1882, possibly even Moses Hess before that, playing a part. The figures are staggering of the casualties of the long period of turmoil in Russia and Central Europe. 600,000 indeed deported in boxcars back to the interior of Russia, but also horrifying pogroms that took place. 1,000 separate pogroms took place as Jews were caught, particularly in Galicia and Ukraine, between the two millstones of the Austro-Hungarian army on the one side and the Russian army on the other. The Russians behaved, possibly you'll not be astonished to hear, much, much worse. Not that the Germans and the Austro-Hungarians were particularly tender towards the Jews they encountered, but they didn't tend to slaughter them and burn down entire cities as they did, particularly when the Russian army was in retreat. It's been estimated conservatively that 200,000 children were orphaned in the Jewish children, orphaned in the ongoing violence between the First World War and the ongoing civil war between 1917 through to 1920. And there are particular moments that were of an extraordinary horror. It's thought 250 burned alive in Fastov. Near Bogoslav, similar arbitrary, atrocious violence meted out to completely defenseless Jewish communities. Why? Why? Because almost the entirety of this huge amount of the Pale of Settlement were thought to be synonymous with spies. Yiddish sounded a whole lot too much like German. The great report of this, if you want to read it, is by the author of the Dybbuk, S. Ansky, who himself had had a career in and out of orthodoxy and then became a social revolutionary, writing only in Russian, came back to writing in Yiddish, mounted a great ethnographic expedition into Volhynia and Podolia in 1912 and 1914. He comes back to the heart of the Pale, the heart of Jewish Russia that he knows very well in 1915. He sees Brody burnt and charred, destroyed, as if he said he was looking at Pompeii. He hears horrifying stories of, a father and son who are taken out to be hanged as spies. I have to say that there was a legend going round which triggered pogroms, that Jews had a secret telephone network by which they communicated Russian troop movements to the enemy. All this is in Ansky's own astonishing account, which was published after his death. I really recommend it to you, called The Destruction of Jewish Galicia. Terrible account of a father who was ordered by, a son who was ordered by Cossack soldiers to hang his own father. They'd both been convicted summarily as spies. And the son said, of course I'm not going to hang my father, and said, well, we'll hang both of you. So his father pleaded with him to hang him, which horrifyingly the son did. And then Ansky says the soldiers sat around laughing while the son was hanged in his turn. There are, other than the industrial Zyklon B nightmare of the Shoah, there's not much about the horrors of the Einsatzgruppen or anything that was not anticipated in the explosive hatred and violence inflicted on Jews around that time. And that is a very, very important context. As Martin said, it's a context for thinking that there was going to be an immense wave of Jewish migration. And bear in mind too, as Martin implied, that because of the Aliens Act, it was very unclear actually which countries, if any, could absorb those who were lucky enough to get out of this death trap between the colliding armies. Remember also that in the United States there'd be increasingly restrictive immigration acts, culminating in the Act of 1921, which again put Jews in an impossible position of desperation when they would, in the end, most need it. Now, the East End, including my mother's family, sorry to inflict all this personal information on you, who were Lithuanian, not like my father's family from Izmir in Romania, my mother's family still had relatives actually trapped in the Ukraine at that time. So the East End knew something of the scale of horror that was being inflicted on these Jewish communities in Central and Eastern Europe. And that, I think, actually fed into the intensity of their suddenly growing enthusiasm for Ein Brera, if you like, for the absolute imperative of a Zionist solution. On the other side, I do think it was probably important, even though cabinet records in their dry-eyed way don't bear it out, that there was a long tradition in the British literary and chattering and political classes of thinking sympathetically about the connection of Jews to Eretz Israel, to Palestine. Weirdly, the first argument I know of, which actually was an explicit championship of the Jews being encouraged to return to Palestine occurs in the 1714 pamphlet written by the deist John Toland, which was mostly really about, which was essentially about the importance of naturalizing the Jewish community, which was already in Britain de facto, because the Jews were not essentially, and again this rhetoric will go on right into the Balfour Declaration, the Jews were capable of extraordinary acts of economic transformation. Toland, who was Irish and a very, very interesting writer, by the way, if you don't know him, Toland actually thought the first place the Jews ought to economically transform, possibly en route to that eventual destination to Palestine, which he inserts at the back of his booklet, was Ireland. And I suppose actually if you'd wanted an even stormier Zion to actually settle in, Ireland would have fitted that particular bill. But the notion that actually Jews simultaneously, on the one hand, were capable of everything that anti-Semitic Canard said they weren't, capable of enterprise, of knowledge, of applied technology, for want of a better word, that they could actually regenerate, which was the buzzword lands, which were usually thought of as incapable of being regenerated, was a particular kind of strand in that political economy thinking. So was, of course, Christian restorationism, sometimes called Christian Zionism. The aim of Christian Zionists was, of course, to re-establish a Jewish presence in the Holy Land, because that was supposed to hasten the eventual mass conversion of the Jews, which in turn would bring about the second coming of the Savior, Jesus Christ. So this was the long-term theological, eschatological program. But in the meantime, it was possible, especially through the 19th century, for Jews and Christians to park their own particular fundamental differences about that conversionary timetable and achieve a certain kind of companionship. It's very important to remember, I think, actually, that this sort of comradeship, notwithstanding Christian conversionary enthusiasm, goes back a long way. I'm always reminded of a wonderful moment, actually, which I describe in volume 2 of the Story of the Jews, of a genuine friendship between the Cardinal of Viterbo, Egidio Antonini, and Eliyahu Bahur, the great Kabbalistic scholar, because they were both interested in Hebrew Kabbalistic writing for very different reasons, but Eliyahu Bahur had actually been teaching Hebrew to the sons of young Italian aristocrats in northern Italy, and when his library was destroyed by the troops of a particular war in 1509, the cardinal invited him and his family to live in the cardinal's palazzo. They were able to park or suspend the ultimate complete incompatibility of their religious destinations to have a comradeship in Hebrew. Such comradeships recur in the Dutch Republic. They recur, of course, famously between Moses Mendelssohn and the playwright Lessing, and they occur a lot in the 19th century, not just George Eliot's famous invention of Daniel Deronda, but in extraordinary figures like Lawrence Oliphant, who'd been MP for Stirling, who is a kind of Christian mystic, but who comes to Haifa and buys land in order that a kind of prototype of an agricultural settlement, a kind of odd version of the kibbutz, could be inaugurated in Galilee. And Oliphant sees again something that, as Ephraim Karsh said, the possibility of the Jewish return not necessarily being to the disadvantage of the Arab population. He feels that very, very strongly. So I think actually there is a kind of, if you like, sedimentation in the heads of people like Arthur Balfour, certainly in the head of the man who was the final editor of the Balfour Declaration, Leo Amery, who was a secret Jew and who was put in the cabinet by Lord Milner, an ultra-imperialist, but who is the person who designs what he takes to be a document that will actually pass a majority of the cabinet. There is a kind of sedimentation of philo-Semitism. And I think part of the part of the reason that happens, part of the extraordinary closeness between Mark Seitz and Weizmann, is that, as has been said before, Weizmann knows how to be Jewish, but not too Jewish. He knows, he has all the skills of creating political friendship that Theodor Herzl, in his kind of tortured, charismatic way, did not quite possess. Weizmann could turn on, like a tap, the sense of the epic of Jewish homelessness and the glories of the Jewish past, what had been shared in those moments of comradeship and friendship. And at the same time, he had an absolutely steel-like Machiavellian grip on the nitty-gritty of political negotiations. And part of that shrewdness on Weizmann's part came out of, and again now I'm stealing Ephraim's remarks or simply wanting to reinforce them, was the genuine belief that it would be possible for a Jewish national home and an Arab national awakening not to be a zero-sum game at all. That meeting with Faisal, it was an extraordinary journey that Weizmann made in the broiling, violent heat of the summer of 1918. They went by boat, but then went by camel, then they went by foot, before eventually they got to Faisal's encampment. And I'm not sure if you mentioned this, Ephraim, but of course the person who contrived the introductions and goodwill between Faisal and Weizmann was T.E. Lawrence, someone who in less sophisticated British historical law is thought to be absolutely a pan-Arabist beyond anything else. Lawrence, in his crazed romantic way, he too believed in what you might think of as the open-hearted, open-ended version of the Balfour Declaration. So when we celebrate the Balfour Declaration, when we celebrate the victory of East End courage, fortitude, chazak ve'ematz, their sense actually that Zion, that a Jewish national home, was ultimately the answer to the epic of homelessness, and it did not prejudice the possibility of a diaspora Jew also feeling an unqualified allegiance to his own home. We indeed ought to be celebrating the possibility of Jewish and Arab understanding not endlessly being on a collision course. And I know you're going to take me as naive and high-minded and a typical professor, but there was someone else in London, someone very close to Weizmann, who wants this to be true, even though he's alternately an optimist and a pessimist. You all know who I mean, class, don't you? He's the agent for the Vysotsky Tea Company, better known as Achad Ha'am. Achad Ha'am was as important to Weizmann as a friend and as a conscience as Nachum Sokolow. Achad Ha'am is someone who wrote Emet Be'eretz Yisrael, who was the first person to draw attention to the fact that if Zionism was going to succeed, it needed at least to confront difficult truths about the Jewish-Arab relationship. And I think that Weizmann took Achad Ha'am's deep sense of conscience, that to be a Zionist you had to face Emet Be'eretz Yisrael, truth from the land of Israel, with him when he made that long, impossible journey to Aqaba. So when we celebrate the Balfour Declaration, paradoxically, we want indeed to go back, if we can, not wipe away, you can't wipe away history, but to close, or try and close the chapter on all the horror and all the bloodshed and all the misunderstanding, and see the Balfour Declaration out of its time, not just actually as the inception of the realization of a 2,000-year-old dream, but also as something which is open to the possibility of a peaceful, expansive, transformed future. And we should celebrate that and celebrate the Balfour Declaration with a full heart and a critical mind, and with the extraordinary sense of courage and determination that everybody in this building and Jews on the right side of history all over the world share too. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Schama. And this remarkable speech concludes our first session. Ladies and gentlemen, you are cordially invited to the buffet lunch, which will take place in the lobby just outside this auditorium. We will begin our second session on UK-Israel relations promptly at 2:15.